She was queen. She was adored. She was the moon and the wolves and everything this kingdom swore to protect. And they stripped it all away in front of 10,000 witnesses without blinking once. But here's what they didn't know when they ripped that crown off her head and handed it to a woman who never earned a single scar for this land. The thing you bury in the cold doesn't always stay dead. If you've been watching from the start, drop your city in the comments. I want to know who's still standing with her. Stay until the end. You'll want to see what wakes up in the dark. The torches along the palace corridor of the north burned low that evening, guttering in a draft that had no business coming through stone walls sealed 3 fingers thick with mortar. Celine noticed it. She noticed everything now. The way the servants moved too fast past her door, the way they kept their eyes aimed at the floor instead of rising to meet hers the way they once had. Deference had a particular texture when it was genuine. This was something else. This was the way a person walks around a fire they already know is going out. She stood at the basin in her dressing chamber and looked at her own face in the polished silver mirror. The woman looking back at her had a jaw set hard enough to split stone and eyes that hadn't gone soft in a long time. High cheekbones her mother had given her before her mother stopped breathing in this world. A mouth that knew how to hold a smile in court even when everything behind it was grinding down to powder. She was 26 years old and had been queen of the Northern Wolf Kingdom for 4 of those years. 4 years since the bonding ceremony beneath the full moon, since Lucian Vale had placed his hands on her shoulders and spoken the words that bound their bloodlines in front of every pack elder and every lord from the Frost Ridge down to the southern salt flats. 4 years since she had come into this palace believing, with the clean, stupid faith of a girl who hadn't yet learned better, that she belonged here. Celine wet a cloth and pressed it to her neck. The water was cold. Everything in the northern wing was cold now. The fire in her hearth had been burning low for 3 days, and no one had come to bank it properly. She had asked once. She had not asked again. Asking twice for something in this palace had a way of marking you. Your Grace. The voice came from the doorway. Mira, her personal attendant, 16 years old, narrow shoulders, hands that were always faintly ink-stained from the correspondence she sorted. One of the few in this palace who still addressed Celine by her actual title instead of finding reasons to avoid the corridor entirely. Come in, Mira. Stop standing in the doorway like you're waiting for permission. The girl stepped inside and closed the door behind her with both hands, the way you close a door when you don't want the sound to carry. Celine turned from the mirror. Say it. Mira's hands were laced in front of her stomach so tight the knuckles had gone pale. The ceremony list has been altered. The standing order of processional, your position in the moon ceremony tonight has been moved. Moved where? To the secondary line, Your Grace. Behind the pack council. Behind... Mira stopped. Swallowed. Behind Lady Crow. Celine was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the basin and squeezed the cloth out slowly, watching the water run clear. Who signed the alteration? The king's seal. But the handwriting on the amendment... Another stop. The girl was picking her words with the kind of care that meant she already knew what she was carrying. Mira. The handwriting belongs to Lady Morwen. There it was. Celine set the cloth down on the basin's rim and straightened up. She breathed once through her nose. The cold draft moved through the room again, and the candle on the dressing table shivered but didn't die. Morwen. Her stepmother. The woman who had appeared in Celine's father's house when Celine was 11 years old, with her perfectly composed smile and her perfectly measured voice, and her hands that were always folded just so, always positioned to look like stillness rather than calculation. The woman who had stood at the bonding ceremony 4 years ago, weeping visible tears while behind her eyes ran an arithmetic Celine had only fully understood too late. How long? Celine said. Your Grace? How long has she been in correspondence with Vanessa Crow? I want your estimate, not a confirmed date. How long does it feel like? Mira was young, but she was not stupid. She'd been in this palace long enough to learn that the walls had ears, and the ears reported upward. Since before the winter recess, she said quietly, the messengers who came to Lady Morwen's suite, they used the Eastern Servants' Passage, the one that connects to the West Annex, where Lucian keeps Vanessa housed. Celine's voice came out flat and even. No heat. Heat was something you couldn't afford when the person listening might be frightened into reporting what they heard. All right. Your Grace, if they've planned something for tonight, they have. Celine moved to the wardrobe and opened it. She ran her hand along the gowns hanging there. Deep blue wool, forest green silk. The white ceremonial dress she had worn to the last moon ceremony, when she had stood beside Lucian in the primary position and felt his hand at her back and thought, briefly, foolishly, that things might stabilize, that the whispers about her failure to conceive might quiet down, that a year of silence for Morwen might actually mean silence rather than a longer game. They wouldn't move me in the processional unless they intended to move me further before the night was done. Mira's face had gone white. She was 16. She had not yet learned to keep the fear from showing. Go to the kitchens, Celine said. Eat something. Don't come back to this corridor tonight. I can't just... Mira. Celine turned and looked at her directly, and the girl went still. There is nothing you can do for me tonight that will change what is going to happen in that arena. And if you are standing near me when it happens, whatever is attached to my name will attach to yours. I am telling you to go. That is a direct instruction from your queen, and it is the last one I will likely give you, so I need you to follow it. Mira's eyes had gone bright and wet at the edges. She was too young for this palace. She always had been. Yes, Your Grace, she whispered, and turned and left, pulling the door shut softly behind her. Celine stood alone in the cold room and looked at the white ceremonial gown. Then she reached past it and took the dark gray wool instead. The royal arena in the northern palace was built for spectacle. It sat at the center of the compound like the hollow of a chest, open to the sky, ringed with tiered stone seating, the floor paved in white granite that showed every footprint, every shadow, every stain. The moon ceremony had been held here for generations. Under the open sky, facing the moon directly, the Pack Council would reaffirm the kingdom's bloodline claims, and the Alpha King would be acknowledged by the wolves as their sovereign. It was tradition, and it was theater, and in the Northern Kingdom there was not much difference between the two. Celine walked the east corridor toward the arena alone. She had sent her guard escort away with a politely worded dismissal and a tone that didn't leave room for argument. She could hear the crowd already, thousands of voices, the particular texture of an audience that had been fed expectation and was waiting to see it paid out. She knew that sound. She had stood at the center of it before, in the good years, when it was her name on their lips and the sound had felt like something she'd earned. The corridor curved and she turned the corner and nearly walked directly into Morwen. Her stepmother was dressed immaculately, deep burgundy with silver trim at the cuffs and collar, her dark hair pinned high, her face arranged in the expression Celine had spent 15 years mapping. Open features, soft eyes, the gentle downward curve of a woman with nothing but concern on her mind. It was a masterwork. Most people never looked past it. Celine, Morwen said, warm, slightly surprised, as though the meeting were accidental. I was hoping to speak with you before the ceremony. Celine stopped 3 feet away. What a coincidence. I wanted you to hear this from me first. Morwen stepped closer, dropping her voice to the register she used when she wanted to perform intimacy. What happens tonight, I want you to understand that I take no pleasure in it. There are forces in this kingdom that I cannot control, and the king has made decisions that... Let me stop you. Celine looked at her stepmother's face with the same steady attention she had given the basin mirror an hour ago. No flinching, no warmth, just examination. I don't need you to perform grief for me. Not tonight. I think we're past the part where that serves either of us. Morwen's expression shifted. The soft concern contracting slightly, the eyes recalibrating. She was good. She recovered fast. You've always been so... What was the offer? Celine said. What did Vanessa give you in exchange for the processional amendment and whatever else you've arranged for tonight? I want to know what I was worth to you in this transaction. A beat. Morwen's chin lifted fractionally. You were never going to give him an heir, Celine. You know that. The Packs were going to fracture over succession within 2 more years. I made a practical decision for the stability of the... What was the offer? The warmth drained out of Morwen's face completely, and what was left was not cold so much as simple, businesslike. The face of a woman who had been in the business of human leverage long enough that none of it surprised her anymore. The eastern counties, your father's lands, held in my name, clear title, after tonight's proceedings are formalized. Celine's father's lands, the fields her father had worked for 30 years, the territory that had passed to Morwen in trust when he died because the marriage contract had given her that power and Celine had been 19 and hadn't known yet what she was signing away. Those lands, given to Morwen in exchange for the step that would finish Celine entirely. He's been dead for 2 years, Celine said quietly, and you still needed to sell something of his to climb. Don't be maudlin. It doesn't suit. Go take your seat. Celine walked forward and Morwen stepped aside. Not quickly enough for it to look like retreat, but it was a retreat. I want to see your face when you remember this moment for the rest of your life. She walked past her and into the arena. Ouch. The cold hit her the moment she stepped through the archway. The particular cold of the northern kingdom in late autumn, the kind that came down from the mountain range and had ice in it, real ice, not just temperature. The arena was packed. Every tier was full. She could see the pack lords in their designated sections, furs and iron wolf pins marking bloodlines going back 8 generations. Merchants in the upper rings, soldiers along the floor perimeter with their hands at their belts, watching the crowd the way soldiers do when they've been told to watch for a specific kind of trouble. Celine walked to the secondary processional line and took her place. She did not look at the primary position. She did not need to. She could hear Vanessa crow before she could see her. The sound of deliberately calibrated laughter, bright and carrying, designed to reach the seats. Vanessa had learned that from somewhere. She was 23, the daughter of a mid-rank border lord, and she had arrived in the capital 2 years ago with a face that stopped conversation in rooms and a talent for identifying exactly what a man needed to hear. Celine had never hated her. Hating Vanessa would have required believing that Vanessa was the actual problem, and Celine had always known better than that. Lucian appeared in the arena from the king's entrance, and the crowd noise shifted in that particular way it did when the Alpha King moved through a space. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, dressed in the black ceremonial armor with the silver wolf crest at the chest. He had a face built for command, the kind of face that made people want to believe whatever it was telling them. Celine had once been among them. She remembered what that felt like. She did not permit herself to feel it now. He moved to the head of the processional, and his eyes found Celine immediately. He looked at her for 2 full seconds. His face showed nothing, not shame, not apology, not even the basic acknowledgement of a man who understood the magnitude of what he was doing. Then he looked away, and that more than anything told her exactly how far this had gone. A man who still had doubt in him would have shown something in those 2 seconds. Guilt leaves a mark on a face even when the person is trying to hide it. Lucian's face was clean. Whatever calculation had led him here, he had finished running it and arrived at his conclusion and made his peace with it. There was nothing left to reach. The pack council elder stepped to the center of the arena floor and raised his staff. The crowd quieted by degrees, the noise settling from roar to murmur to something close to silence. We gather under the moon, the elder began, his voice carrying the weight of recitation rather than meaning. We gather to affirm the bloodline, to name the sovereign, I call for a grievance declaration. The voice cut across the elder's words clean and flat. Celine recognized it. Harkon Vast, Lord of the Western Ridge Pack, a man with a grievance-shaped face and a history of using procedural tools the way other men used weapons. He was on his feet in the pack lord's tier, his wolf pin catching the torchlight. The elder paused. A grievance declaration requires a ranking bloodline lord and a matter of kingdom stability. I have both. Vast's eyes moved across the arena floor until they found Celine in the secondary line. He did not look uncomfortable. He had been paid for this comfort, or promised something, and the certainty of it sat visible on his features. The matter concerns Queen Celine Arden Vale and her fitness to hold the crown of the Northern Kingdom. The sound that went through the crowd was not surprise. It was the sound of people who had already heard the shape of this and were now watching it take form. Celine felt it the way you feel a current moving through water beneath you, not visible, but present and pulling. She did not move from her position. Speak it then, the elder said, because the procedure required him to. Vast descended from the tier to the arena floor. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man performing for an audience he had already assessed. The Northern Kingdom requires an heir. This is not preference. It is survival. Pack unity demands a clear succession line, and after 4 years of marriage, the queen has provided none. The wolves of the border packs have begun to scatter. 3 elder wolves abandoned their posts on the northern line in the last moon cycle alone. The land is reading the throne. What the throne says, the land follows. "This is pack council business," said another lord from the tier. Old Corvin Stahl, who had gray in his beard and the careful voice of a man who had survived 4 administration changes. "A grievance declaration of this magnitude requires a full council deliberation before—" "The king has already convened the deliberation," Vass said. "In private session, 6 days ago. I am announcing the outcome." The crowd sound changed again. Celine kept her eyes on the center of the arena and breathed slowly through her mouth. 6 days. The deliberation had been held 6 days ago, and she had been in this palace for every one of those 6 days, eating in the same dining hall, sleeping in the same corridor, attending the same morning appointments. They had held the deliberation and made the decision and continued to let her exist in this palace as if nothing had happened, and every servant who would not meet her eyes and every guard who stood a foot further from her door than protocol required now made complete sense. "Lord Vast," Celine said. Her voice came out level. Not loud. She didn't need loud. The arena had been built for acoustics, and the silence was absolute now. It carried. Vast turned to look at her, and there was a fraction of a second where something moved in his expression. Not guilt. More like the mild recalibration of a man who had not expected her to speak first. "You have delivered your declaration," she said. "Now tell the arena the rest of it. Tell them what decision was reached in this private session and who was present at the table." "The decision?" "Tell them who was at the table, Lord Vast." He hesitated. Behind him, in her peripheral vision, Celine saw Lucien take 1 step forward and stop. She did not look at him. Vast recovered. "The decision reached was that the crown of the Northern Kingdom cannot continue to rest on a queen who has demonstrated an inability to fulfill the primary obligation of the bloodline bond. For the stability of the packs and the security of succession, the bonding declaration is to be dissolved," Lucien said. He said it from where he stood, and his voice carried the authority of a man who had been using it to fill rooms since he was 16. It was not cruel. That was the thing. It was administrative. The tone a man uses when he is announcing a decision that has already been made, and the announcement itself is the last formality. Celine turned and looked at him directly. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not regret, not exactly, but recognition. The way a person looks at the thing they are breaking when they want to acknowledge that they know what it is, even if they have decided to break it anyway. "The bonding is dissolved," he said again. "By the authority of the Alpha King and the confirmation of the Pack Council in private session. Celine Arden she is denounced." The new voice, from the upper tier. Celine looked up. Morwen stood at the rail of the second tier, and her voice rang across the arena with the sharp, clear tone of a woman who had been preparing for this specific moment and intended to make it land. "I speak as bloodkin. I speak with the knowledge of a woman who has watched this queen manage her position in this palace for 4 years. What I have observed," Morwen let the pause sit, "is conduct unbecoming of the crown. Private correspondence with lords of rival packs. Meetings conducted without the king's knowledge. Information passed through channels that do not serve this kingdom's security." The silence in the arena was the dense kind, the kind that has weight. "She is a traitor," Morwen said, and her voice did not shake at all. "To the man she bonded, to the kingdom she was given, and to the bloodline she swore to protect." The word hit the crowd the way a stone hits water. The rings went outward. Celine could hear it. Not noise exactly, but the shift of 10,000 people adjusting their understanding of what they were watching. Treason. That was new. That was beyond dissolution of the bonding, beyond failure of the bloodline obligation, beyond all the whispers about heirs and wolf signs and dwindling pack loyalty. Treason was the word that made a person not just dischargeable, but destroyable, that made everything that had been hers subject to claim, that made it impossible for any lord or pack leader or merchant ally to stand beside her without risk. Celine looked up at Morwen on the tier and understood with absolute clarity what she was seeing. Not a woman who had been maneuvered into this by Vanessa or by Lucian or by the pressures of pack politics. A woman who had planned from the beginning, who had arrived in her father's house when Selene was 11 with a long-range calculation already in progress. Who had waited with the patience that only certain kinds of ambition are capable of, for the moment when all the pieces were positioned correctly and the word could land with maximum effect. "That is a lie," Selene said. Her voice was still level. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, keeping her voice level in that arena with 10,000 people watching and the word treason still hanging in the cold air above all of them. "It is a deliberate and constructed lie, delivered by a woman who has arranged everything you have witnessed tonight, in consultation with Lady Crow and with the private council, over a period of months. I have no correspondence with rival packs. I have passed no information through unauthorized channels. What I have done is exist in this palace as queen, without producing a result that satisfied the people who had already decided I was expendable, and that is the sum total of my offense." Murmuring in the crowd. Not agreement. She was not so optimistic as to read it as agreement, but uncertainty. Some portion of the 10,000 were listening with minds that had not yet entirely closed. Then Vanessa walked onto the arena floor. She had timed it. That was the professional's observation that lived somewhere cold and separate in Selene's mind, even in the middle of everything. The timing was precise. She appeared at the moment when Selene's voice had just finished, and the crowd murmur was still open, unsettled, before it could organize itself. She entered from the king's archway wearing a gown of deep silver white that the torchlight turned incandescent, and she walked with the calm of a woman who had rehearsed this approach and knew exactly what she looked like from every angle. She was carrying the crown, Selene's crown, the crown of the Northern Queen, the silver-wrought piece with the wolf's head inlays that had sat on Selene's head since the bonding ceremony 4 years ago. Vanessa held it in both hands, level, as though it were something she was presenting rather than something she intended to claim. And the whole arena watched her cross the floor. She stopped in front of Lucian. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and took the crown from her hands, and he turned, and he looked at Selene. "Selene Arden," he said, "you are hereby stripped of your title, your position, and your place in this palace. By the authority of the Alpha King and by the judgment of the Pack Council, you are banished from the northern capital and from the territories under the Wolf Kingdom's sovereign claim." He paused. "Any person who offers you shelter within these boundaries is complicit in harboring a denounced traitor." The word traitor, coming from his mouth now, given the full weight of his authority. The crowd went very still. Selene stood in the secondary processional line and looked at the man she had bonded 4 years ago and tried to find something in her chest that still responded to him. She found nothing. Not grief. She had spent the last 6 days grieving him, or grieving the person she had believed him to be, and whatever that process had cost her, it had finished itself in her before she'd walked into this arena. What was left was something harder and quieter and more durable, the kind of thing that forms in a person when everything softer has been burned away. She said nothing. Lucian turned to Vanessa. He held the crown over her head, and before he could place it, Selene said, "Lucian?" He paused. The crown held level in his hands. "Look at the wolves," she said. It was not loud, it was not dramatic. It was the tone of someone pointing out something that the other person needed to see before they made a decision they could not undo. He looked. The soldiers along the arena perimeter looked. The pack lords and the tiers looked. The 4 royal wolves, who were always present for the moon ceremony, who had stood at their posts at the corners of the arena floor through every ceremony for 3 years without deviation, were gone. Their posts were empty, not vacant in the way of an animal that had wandered, empty in the way of something deliberate, something chosen, something that had made a decision about where it would and would not stand. The murmuring that went through the crowd now was different from before. This had a current to it. This was the sound of people who had grown up in the Wolf Kingdom, knowing what it meant when the wolves withdrew from a royal ceremony. "The land reads the throne," Selene said, and let it land. Lucian placed the crown on Vanessa's head. The silver touched her hair, and the torch nearest the arena floor flared once, a single violent surge of light, and then darkness as the flame died completely, leaving that corner of the arena in shadow. No one moved for a moment. Then a soldier went to relight it, and the moment passed and the crowd began to make noise again, and it was done. Celine was escorted from the arena by two guards she did not know, men with faces she couldn't place from her years in the palace, which told her they had been brought in specifically for this task from a garrison far enough away that they wouldn't recognize her as anything other than a name on an order. She walked with them out of the arena and into the corridor and through the palace gates she had entered as a bride 4 years ago. And the gates closed behind her, and she stood in the night air outside the walls of everything that had been hers. And the cold came in from the mountains, and she breathed it in and let it fill her lungs. The guards turned back without speaking. Their job was finished. Celine stood alone on the road outside the palace walls, with nothing but the dark wool dress and the cold and the mountain wind. She looked up. The moon was full and hard and very bright, and in the silence she could hear faintly from somewhere up in the mountain range that no one entered and no one mapped. The sound she had heard only once before in her life, on the night of her bonding, when she had stood under the open sky and felt something ancient acknowledge her existence. Howling. Not from one direction, from many, getting closer, and beneath her skin tracing lines she had never seen before. Something silver began to burn. You said, Part 2. Với tư cách là một người kể chuyện và biên kịch điện ảnh chuyên nghiệp, hãy triển khai Part 2 của kịch bản dựa trên diễn biến đã kết thúc ở Part 1. Part 2. Với tư cách là một người kể chuyện và biên kịch điện ảnh chuyên nghiệp, hãy triển khai Part 2 của kịch bản dựa trên diễn biến đã kết thúc ở Part 1. Mục tiêu là tạo ra một bản thảo lồng tiếng dày dặn, giàu tính phản biện và kịch tính để phục vụ video YouTube dài 2 tiếng. Yêu cầu kỹ thuật và giá trị tường thuật, hóa giải lời YouTube. Cấu trúc và dụng lượng 2.500 đến 3.000 từ. Bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của Part 1, không tóm tắt lại. Triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh, scene by scene, liên mạch. Narrative commentary, tăng giá trị bình luận. Đây là yêu cầu bắt buộc để đối phó với lời của YouTube. Hãy lồng ghép bản năng chiếm hữu và triết lý thống trị trực tiếp vào độc thoại nội tâm của nhân vật. Miêu tả nó như một cơ chế sinh tồn tất yếu thay vì một thói xấu. Mỗi chiêm nghiệm về bản lĩnh khi bị dồn vào đường cùng phải hòa tan vào lựa chọn nghiệt ngã và phản ứng cơ thể, ánh mắt, nhịp thở của nhân vật. Tuyệt đối không để AI đưa ra các nhận định đạo đức hay giảng bài. Triết lý thay đổi để tồn tại phải nằm trốn trong dòng chảy hành động để tăng tối đa giá trị tường thuật cinematic. Hội thoại và xung đột. Mật độ hội thoại phải chiếm hơn 50%. Các cuộc đối thoại cần gãy gọn, mang tính tấn công, giàu ý ngầm, subtext, đặc trưng của phong cách Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ. Thể hiện sự áp đặt quyền lực và sự im lặng ngột ngạt giữa các nhân vật. Yếu tố con người tập trung vào các phản ứng bản năng, ánh mắt, áp lực tâm lý, hơi thở. Sử dụng giống văn Mỹ thô ráp, tránh các mô tả mượt mà hay mùi AI sáo rộng. Quy tắc thực thi nghiêm ngặt, tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, không tiêu đề phụ, không nhắc đến tôn giáo, không sử dụng dấu ngoặc trong toàn bộ văn bản để bảo vệ metadata, kết thúc bằng một nút thất không thể quay đầu, point of no return. Trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn, chỉ dẫn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung. Đây là tác phẩm hư cấu 100% phục vụ mục đích nghệ thuật và giải trí, không ngụ ý đây là sự thật. Trả lời trực tiếp trong mục tin nhắn. Show more. 1536. Claude responded, Part 2. What the cold makes of you. View. Part 2. What the cold makes of you. The howling did not stop. Did not. It rolled down from the mountain range in overlapping waves, one voice answering another the way thunder answers lightning. Not random, not wild, but structured, deliberate. The way a language sounds when you are hearing it for the first time, and your body understands it before your mind does. Celine stood on the road outside the palace gates and felt the sound move through her sternum like a hand pressing from the inside. The silver lines beneath her skin burned. Not hot. Wrong word. Burned the way cold iron burns when you grip it barehanded in winter. The sensation started at her wrists and ran upward along her forearms, branching at the elbow, tracing a pattern she couldn't see in the dark but could feel with absolute precision. She turned her right arm over and looked at it. Nothing visible. The burning continued regardless. She started walking, not toward the capital road, not toward the southern territories where she might have found a lord willing to shelter her for 2 days before the risk calculation turned against her. She walked north, toward the mountains. She couldn't have explained the decision in language that would have satisfied anyone asking for a rational account of it. It was not a decision so much as an orientation. The way a compass needle isn't deciding to point north, it's simply responding to something that was already there. The road deteriorated within the first mile. Packed gravel gave way to dirt. Dirt gave way to frozen ground. Frozen ground gave way to the kind of terrain that only existed above the timberline. Loose shale, frost-cracked stone, wind that came down off the peaks carrying ice crystals that found the gap between her collar and her jaw and worked at it methodically. She had no supplies, no weapon. The dress was wool, and it was good wool, the kind that stayed warm, even wet. But it was still a dress, and she was still climbing a mountain in late autumn in the dark. She climbed. The burning under her skin spread to her shoulders by the time she reached the first ridge. By the time she crossed the second, it had reached her collarbone and she could feel it moving along the back of her neck, precise and branching, like something writing itself into her. She did not stop to examine it. Stopping meant thinking about how cold she was, how her fingers had gone from painful to numb, how the altitude was thinning the air to something her lungs had to work harder to use. Stopping meant giving the cold permission to tell her what it intended. The wolves found her before she found the shrine. She heard them first, not the distant howling from the mountain heights, but something closer, something that moved through the rock brush to her left with the particular silence of a large animal choosing to be quiet rather than incapable of noise. She stopped walking. Her breath came out in a plume of white vapor. She looked left, yellow eyes, 3 pairs, spaced at different heights in the darkness. 1 pair low, 1 pair at mid-level, 1 pair above that, as though the wolves were standing on different ledges. They watched her with the flat, comprehensive attention of things that did not carry assumptions in their gaze the way humans did. No aggression, no submission, just watching. "All right," Celine said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. The cold had gotten into her throat. She cleared it and held the nearest pair of eyes and said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say. Either they had come to lead her somewhere or they hadn't. Stating her situation to them would not change their intention. The low pair of eyes moved. The wolf stepped out of the brush, and she could see it. Large, pale gray, its coat thick with the kind of winter insulation that took years of mountain living to grow. It looked at her for another moment. Then it turned and walked north along the ridge, and paused and looked back. She followed. The shrine was carved into the base of a cliff face 2 ridges above the timberline, in a place where the rock overhang created a natural chamber approximately 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide. The entrance was narrow enough that she had to turn sideways to pass through, and when she came out the other side she understood immediately why no one had found it. From the outside it looked like nothing but a crack in the cliff face, and the crack was behind a boulder that required deliberate navigation to get around. You would not stumble on this place. You would be brought to it. The chamber was dry. That was the first thing she registered. The specific relief of air that hadn't been turned into a weapon by the wind. The second thing was the walls. They were covered in markings, floor to ceiling on 3 sides, carved deep enough into the stone that they had survived however many centuries had passed since the carving. She raised her hand toward the nearest wall and stopped before touching it. The markings were the same shape as the lines burning under her skin. Exactly the same. Not similar, not thematically related. Identical. The branching pattern at the same angles, the central trunk running the same direction, the same fine detail work at the terminus of each branch. She looked at her arm and looked at the wall, and something in her chest made a sound she did not let out. The pale gray wolf had followed her inside. The other 2 remained at the entrance, visible as shapes in the dark. The pale wolf moved to the center of the chamber and sat down and looked at her. "You've been waiting," she said. The wolf held her eyes. It didn't move. For how long? Not a question she expected an answer to, and not one she received. But the burning under her skin intensified at the moment she spoke, which she took as information of some kind. She sat down on the cold stone floor because her legs had spent everything they had, getting her up the mountain, and they were done pretending otherwise. She sat and looked at the markings and breathed and tried to get her internal temperature above the level where decision-making became unreliable. She was the last descendant of the Moon Queens. She did not know that yet in the way that language works. She did not have the sentence assembled in her mind, but she felt it in the chamber the way you feel the truth of something that has always been true and that you have simply been standing too close to see, like stepping back from a painting until the image resolves. The markings on the wall were not decoration. They were a record. A bloodline record, she understood. Reading the pattern the way you read a pattern once your eye finds the structure. Names in the old wolf tongue. Lives compressed into marks. A line that began at the top of the wall and ran downward through generations and ended at the floor. No, not the floor. She was sitting at the end of the line. What then? She did not sleep. She was too cold and too awake for sleep, and the burning under her skin was too present to permit unconsciousness. She sat in the shrine through the rest of the night, and the wolves at the entrance changed once. The two outside swapped in quiet rotation with two others she hadn't seen, which told her there were more of them out there, which told her this had not been spontaneous. They had been positioned. Someone, or something, had deployed them to find her. Dawn came gray and slow. The light reached the shrine entrance and moved across the floor toward her by degrees. And when it reached the markings on the wall opposite the entrance, the carved lines cast shadows that changed the image. What looked at night like a continuous line looked in angled morning light like a series of choices. Branch points. Every generation had been a branch point, a moment when the line could have gone one way or another, and the fact that she existed was the accumulated result of every one of those choices going a specific direction. She thought about Morwen's face when she had said the words. That is a deliberate and constructed lie. She thought about the clean absence on Lucian's face when he held the crown over Vanessa's head. She thought about Mira's ink-stained hands and the careful way she'd pulled the door shut. There were things Celine could do nothing about, and things she could. This was a discipline she had learned early, not from anyone who taught it to her deliberately, but from the structure of growing up in a house where one parent had died and the other had been replaced by someone with different intentions. You learned fast to stop spending energy on the fixed column and put everything into the variable one. Morwen had been at this for longer than Celine had understood. Lucien had made his calculation and executed it. Those were fixed. What was variable was what she did next. The pale wolf rose from the center of the chamber. It walked to the back wall, the one she hadn't fully examined, and sat in front of a section of markings that were different from the others, more recent. The carving was shallower, the edges less weathered. She got up and went to look. The old wolf tongue was not a language she had been taught, but the markings here were simpler, more pictographic, less abstract, and she had spent 4 years in a palace with a library that included histories of the northern bloodlines, and she had read them the way a woman reads things, when she suspects the information might eventually matter more than she currently understands. She stood at the wall and read. It took time. Not every symbol resolved into meaning, maybe 1 in 3, but 1 in 3 was enough to get the architecture of it. The Moon Queens were not a title. They were a bloodline function, a line of women who carried something specific in their inheritance, something that predated the Alpha King structure by generations, something that the Wolf Kingdom had been built on top of without fully understanding what it was building on. The bond between the Moon Queens and the ancient wolves was not ceremonial. It was structural. The wolves didn't attend the moon ceremony as symbols. They attended because the ceremony was theirs, or had been, before the Alpha line systematized it into something political. Celine had been bonded to Lucian in a ceremony that used the form of the moon bond without the substance, like using an old vessel for new water and telling everyone it was the original. The land was reading the throne. Lord Vast had said it as an accusation. He had meant it as evidence of her failure. But standing in the shrine with the branching lines burning under her skin and the ancient wolves sitting at her back, she understood that the land reading the throne was not the problem. The land reading the throne was the mechanism. And what the land had read was not her failure. It had read the substitution. She came down from the mountain on the second day, moving slowly because her right ankle had caught a rock wrong on the descent and had swollen to something that made each step a specific negotiation. The pale wolf walked beside her. The others ranged ahead and behind, visible at intervals through the brush, their presence less an escort than a statement of position. They were not following her exactly. They were with her. There was a difference. She reached the lower timberline by afternoon and found the woodcutter's path that ran along the mountain's eastern base. She had known the path existed. She had seen it on a survey map in the palace library 3 years ago while she was reading about the northern boundary territories. One of those pieces of information that had seemed contextual at the time and now presented itself as load-bearing. The woodcutter's settlement was 4 structures: 2 storage sheds, a workshop, a house. Smoke from the house. 2 horses in the lean-to on the south side. She stood at the tree line and assessed it for a moment, then walked out of the trees toward the house. The door opened before she reached it. A woman appeared in the doorway. 50, maybe 55. The kind of age that shows up differently on people who have worked outdoors their whole lives, which makes it hard to read precisely. She had a woodcutter's hands and a watchman's eyes, and she looked at Celine and then looked at the pale wolf standing 4 feet to Celine's left, and then looked back at Celine. "You're the queen," the woman said. "I was." Celine stopped at the bottom of the 3 steps up to the porch. "I need water, and I need to sit somewhere that isn't a mountain. If you have food to spare, I will owe you for it. If you don't, water is enough." The woman studied her for a moment. Her eyes went to the wolves at the tree line. There were 4 visible from where they stood, sitting at the edge of the forest in a loose row, watching the house. She looked at them for a long time. "They called you," the woman said. "Not a question." "They found me." "That's not what I said." The woman's eyes came back to Celine's face. "My grandmother told me stories about the ones the old wolves called. Said it hadn't happened in her grandmother's time. Said the last time it happened, the kingdom was different after." "Your grandmother was right," Celine said. Another beat of assessment. Then the woman stepped back from the doorway and held it open. "Come in, then. Mind the step." Her name was Dara. She gave Celine water and hard bread and a bowl of something hot that had root vegetables in it, and asked no questions while Celine ate, which was a form of courtesy Celine had rarely received from people who knew who she was. When the bowl was empty, Dara sat down across the table and folded her hands on the wood and looked at her directly. "The capital sent riders through yesterday," Dara said, "following the eastern base path. 6 of them, wearing the king's colors. They weren't asking about timber supply." "No," Celine said. "They weren't. They stopped here, asked if I'd seen anyone come down off the mountain." Celine set the water cup down on the table. "What did you tell them?" "Told them the only things coming off the mountain lately were rocks and bad weather." Dara's expression didn't change. "They believed me or they didn't. They moved on south. The execution order had been given then. Morwen hadn't waited for the formal proceedings to finish. She had understood that formal proceedings were slow, and Celine alive was unpredictable, and the order had gone out before Celine had even reached the shrine. 6 riders on the eastern base path meant more on the western base path, and probably a patrol on the northern road above the timberline, which meant they had planned for the possibility that she might try to go up rather than down. Which meant someone had known about the shrine, or suspected she might go toward the mountains, which meant... "She told them where to look," Celine said, mostly to herself. Morwen knew about the eastern base path. She had been in this territory long enough. She had the palace survey maps. And she was systematic in the way that people are systematic when they have been planning a single outcome for years and have thought through the contingencies. She had told the riders where Celine might come down. "You need to move," Dara said. "I know. There's a second path. Runs north of the logging trail, through the river cut. It comes out on the far side of the valley, past the ridge that separates the northern territory from the eastern province border. The king's jurisdiction ends at that ridge. Technically." Celine looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Dara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window. Through it, the pale wolf was visible, sitting on the path outside the house, facing the tree line, watching. "Because my grandmother told me what happens when the old wolves call someone," she said, "and I'm not going to be the woman who blocked that road." Celine stood up. Her ankle protested. She breathed through it. "If the riders come back..." "I've been telling people the mountain ate their livestock for 20 years, Dara said. "I can tell them the mountain ate a person." Tussing. She was on the river-cut path before the light started to go, moving at the pace her ankle allowed, which was slower than she wanted and faster than was probably wise. The pale wolf stayed with her. 2 others ranged ahead, their movement through the brush audible only when they allowed it to be, which told her something about how they managed themselves. They were not hiding from her. They were choosing when to be perceptible. The burning under her skin had changed since the shrine. It was no longer a question. The sensation had settled into something more like statement. The lines were there. They were part of her now, or had always been part of her, and what the shrine had done was make them legible to her own body. She felt the wolves in the trees not as a presence she detected, but as a presence she knew. The way you know the position of your own hand without looking at it. This was the thing that Morwen hadn't calculated, not because Morwen wasn't thorough. She was. But you cannot calculate for something you don't believe exists. Morwen believed in politics, in bloodline leverage, in the careful management of perception, and in the patience required to dismantle a person's position piece by piece. She believed in what was visible and what was transactional. The shrine, the ancient wolves, the lines burning under Celine's skin, these were stories. Grandmother's stories. The kind of thing you allowed to exist in the cultural background without ever expecting to have to account for it in the forward planning. That was the crack in the wall, not a large crack. But the ancient wolves were real, and the shrine was real, and whatever was written in Celine's bloodline was real, and Morwen had spent everything to remove a queen and had not known what she was actually removing. The path topped the last ridge as the sun disappeared completely behind the western peaks. Celine stopped at the crest and looked back, south and west, toward where the capital sat behind its walls with its torches burning and its new queen settled on a throne that the land had already begun to reject. She breathed the cold air in and felt the lines under her skin pulse once, strongly, in something that was not quite rhythm, but was close to it. Then, from below the ridge, on the far side of the eastern descent, a single torch appeared, then two, then six. Moving in the pattern of a coordinated search formation spread across the valley floor, covering all three exit paths from the river cut at once. They had found the second route, and there was nowhere left to run. 6 torches on the valley floor, then 8. The formation spread wide across all 3 exit points with the mechanical precision of men who had been given a map and a target and enough motivation not to ask questions about either. Celine stood at the ridge crest and watched them and ran the arithmetic fast. The river cut behind her was the only path she had come up. Going back down, it meant moving toward the capital, toward Lucian's jurisdiction, toward whatever the formal execution order said about method and timing. The eastern descent ahead of her was blocked. The northern face of the ridge was shale and ice, and vertical enough that a healthy person with proper equipment would have thought carefully before attempting it. She had a swollen ankle and dark wool. The pale wolf stood beside her left knee and looked at the torches. "I see them," Celine said. The wolf turned and looked at the northern face. "That's a cliff." The wolf looked at her, then at the cliff, then at her again, with the flat patience of something that has already run the calculation and arrived at the only answer and is waiting for the slower party to catch up. Celine looked at the northern face for a long moment. The torches below were moving. The formation was tightening, the flanking torches swinging inward to close the spread. They knew she was on the ridge, or they suspected it, and either way the effect was the same. She had perhaps 4 minutes before the most aggressive of the searchers reached the base of the ridge and started up. She looked at the pale wolf. "Don't let me fall." She started up the northern face. It was the worst thing she had done since the mountain. That was the only way to categorize it. Not frightening exactly, because fear requires the bandwidth to process consequence, and she did not have the bandwidth, but a sustained negotiation between her body and the rock that demanded everything she had and gave nothing back. Her hands went from painful to raw within the first 50 feet. The swollen ankle screamed every time her right foot bore weight at an angle, which was every other step on a shale face, and she breathed through it in short, controlled bursts. The way you breathe through something when stopping is not an option. The pale wolf moved beside and slightly above her on the face, finding ledges she couldn't see, pausing at each one until she reached it. Not guiding exactly, more like demonstrating that the next hold existed before she committed to it. The other wolves had vanished from her perception. She did not know if they had gone to meet the riders, or gone ahead, or simply faded into the dark, and she did not have the processing space to concern herself with it. She reached the top of the face 20 feet above the ridge crest, and pulled herself over the edge, and lay flat on the rock and breathed for 30 seconds. Below, she could hear voices now. Not words yet, but the directional quality of men talking to each other while they moved, which meant the base of the ridge, which meant less time than she'd calculated. She got up and moved. The eastern province border was a river, not a large river. In summer it would have been fordable at the knee, a boundary marker more symbolic than physical. In late autumn, it was knee-deep, fast-moving, and cold enough that the rocks along its bank had ice fringes. Celine stood at the bank in the dark and looked at it and crossed without stopping to think about it, because thinking about it would have been the same as not crossing, and not crossing was not available to her. The cold hit her knees and moved upward immediately. She fixed her eyes on the far bank and walked. The current pushed at her, and the rocks were uneven under her feet, and her ankle turned twice on the crossing, and both times she caught herself and kept moving. She came out the other side with her dress from the waist down soaked through and her legs in the first stage of something she could not afford to let finish. She kept moving. Moving was warmth. Moving was time. Moving was the only jurisdiction she still had over her own situation. The Eastern Province was Harmon territory. Lord Cade Harmon, 60 years old, 3 sons in the king's military, a reputation for pragmatic neutrality that had kept him alive through 2 regime turbulences and 1 border war. He was not an ally. He was not an enemy. He was a man who had survived by being neither, which meant he would not shelter her out of loyalty, but might shelter her out of calculation if she presented the situation correctly. The wolves found her again 2 miles inside the Eastern Province, not the pale wolf, which had stopped at the riverbank and watched her cross without following, but 2 others she hadn't seen before, darker coated, moving with the same coordinated quiet. They flanked her without preamble and walked with her, and she accepted their presence the way she had accepted the cold, which was without sentiment and with gratitude. The Harmon estate sat behind a low stone wall at the end of a farmland road. There were lights in the main house. Celine walked to the gate and stopped, and a guard appeared on the wall above her within 30 seconds, faster than she expected, which meant the gate was watched more carefully than a neutral lord's estate typically was, which meant Cade Harmon had heard something and was being cautious about who came through his gate in the dark. "I need to speak with Lord Harmon," she said. The guard looked at her, looked at the wolves, looked back at her. "Who's asking?" "Celine Arden, former queen of the Northern Kingdom." She said it without decoration because decoration would have been a waste of both their time. "Tell him the ancient wolves are walking her border and that I need an hour of his time. He can decide after that." A pause. The guard disappeared. She stood at the gate with the wolves at her flanks and waited, and the cold worked at her wet clothing, and she breathed steadily and kept her spine straight because how you stand at a gate when everything has gone wrong is not a small thing. It is the first information the person inside receives about you. She was not going to give Cade Harmon a collapsed woman. She was going to give him a problem worth engaging with. The gate opened. Harmon met her in the front hall rather than making her wait in a receiving room, which told her he was either genuinely curious or genuinely concerned, and either one was workable. He was built the way old soldiers are built. The muscle gone somewhat soft with age, but the frame still substantial, gray in his beard, eyes that moved over her with the fast, comprehensive scan of someone who had spent decades reading situations before committing to them. His eyes stopped on her hands, the silver lines. They had become visible sometime in the last hour. She had noticed them on the river crossing when the moonlight caught her forearms. Visible now, faint but undeniable, tracing the same branching pattern as the shrine walls under the skin of both arms from wrist to shoulder. "You want to sit," Harmon said. "I want to be dry." Celine looked at him. "I'll sit when we've talked." A beat. He almost smiled. He turned and said something to a servant that she didn't catch, and the servant went somewhere, and Harmon walked into the room off the main hall that served as his study, and she followed him. He did not offer pleasantries. She respected that. He poured 2 cups of something from a flask on the desk. Not wine, something darker, and set one in front of her and took the other and stood at the fireplace and said, "The king's riders came through my eastern road this afternoon. They were looking for you." "I know." "They carried a formal execution order, countersigned by Lady Morwen Arden and Lord Vast." He looked at the fire. "Treason charge." "Constructed," Celine said. "You know that. What I know is that there's a signed execution order in the king's name circulating through every lord's territory on the eastern border." His eyes came back to her. "What I know is that 6 wolves are sitting in my courtyard right now, and my own dogs have gone completely silent, which they have never done in the 30 years I've kept them." A pause. "And what I know is that you crossed my river in the dark with what looks like the old bloodline marks burning on your arms." "Yes. So tell me what you want from me." Celine set the cup down on the desk. "Passage. through your territory to the northern reaches. There's a network of pack settlements above the Frost Ridge that have never fully integrated into the king's authority structure. If I can reach the reach settlements before the riders circle around, I have a position to work from." Harmon was quiet for a moment. He turned the cup in his hand. "Working from a position," he said, "against Lucian Vale, with 6 wolves and bloodline marks." His tone was not dismissive, but it was the tone of a man doing math. "What's the plan beyond reaching the reaches?" "The land is already rejecting Vanessa. You know this. Your pack contacts will have told you. The border wolves are abandoning the northern line. Crops are failing in the eastern settlements. The old bond between the throne and the territory is breaking down because the bond was never between the throne and Vanessa. It was between the territory and the bloodline. And the bloodline is standing in your study." Harmon looked at her for a long time. "If I give you passage and this goes wrong—" "If it goes wrong, I'll be dead, and the execution order will be satisfied, and you can tell the king's men you found me collapsed in the eastern forest and had nothing to do with it." She met his eyes. "But it's not going to go wrong." She said it with the clean, flat certainty of someone who was not performing confidence but had simply arrived at a place where the alternative was not a thing she was willing to hold in her mind. The shrine, the wolves, the lines burning on her arms, these were not symbols. They were structural. The kingdom had been built on something, and the something was still there, beneath the politics and the succession games and Morwen's long patience, beneath all of it, unchanged. Harmon set his cup down. "I'll give you dry clothes, a horse, and a guide to the Reach Road." He paused. "That's the edge of what I can do." "That's enough," Celine said. Eat. She was changed and mounted and moving before the next hour was out, on a dark bay horse that Harmon's stable master selected without comment, the kind of animal chosen for endurance over display. The guide was a young man named Fen, maybe 20, not a talker, which suited her, who knew the territory roads well enough to move at a pace in the dark that surprised her. The wolves ran alongside and slightly ahead, visible at intervals as shapes in the moonlight, their movement effortless over the frozen ground. She watched them when the road was clear enough to permit the attention and felt the lines on her arms pulse in something that was almost rhythm, almost communication, almost language. Not quite. Not yet. They were 3 miles from the Reach Road when Fen pulled up his horse. "Someone on the road ahead," he said quietly. Celine pulled up beside him. She looked. Torchlight, single source, not moving, not a patrol formation, not a search line. A single torch, stationary, in the middle of the road. "That's not the king's men," she said. "No?" Fen's voice had gone careful in a way that was different from the careful he'd been using all night. "That's a Reach runner. The coat." He paused. "The Reach settlements send runners when they want to stop someone on the road without ambushing them. It means they want to talk." The wolves had stopped. All 6 of them, arranged across the road in a loose line, sitting, facing the torch. Celine rode forward alone. The runner was a woman, older than she'd looked from distance, somewhere in her 40s, weathered, wearing the rough-stitched long coat of the northern settlements with a wolf fur collar. She held the torch up and looked at Celine's face, and then at the marks on her arms, and said nothing for a moment. "You're going to the Reaches," the woman said. "That's right." "You can't." The woman's voice was flat and without apology. "The Reach Settlement Council met 4 days ago. There was a vote." She looked at Celine steadily. "The king sent a representative before the execution order, offered the settlement's formal charter recognition, autonomy guarantees, reduced tribute, 3 seats on the pack council. In exchange for one thing." Celine felt the cold settle differently on her skin. "What one thing?" "Denial of shelter to any person traveling under a treason charge." The runner met her eyes. "The council voted 11-4 in favor. The charter was signed yesterday morning." 11-4. The Reach settlements, the last independent territory. The network she had built her entire surviving plan around, the place she had been moving toward since the shrine, had been bought before she arrived. The king's representative had gone ahead. Morwen had known about the Reaches too, had known that was the logical destination, had sent someone to close it before Celine could reach it. The road behind her had the riders. The road ahead had a closed door. The eastern province had given her a horse and a guide, and the limit of what it could offer. The wolves were sitting in the road watching her, and the lines on her arms were burning, and she was on a dark bay horse in the middle of the frozen eastern province with nowhere left to go, and an execution order circulating through every territory within reach. She sat on the horse and breathed and looked at the torch, and let the reality of it land without flinching from it. This was the thing about being downed completely. Not reduced, not disadvantaged, but structurally cornered, with every viable path accounted for and blocked. You found out at that point what you were actually made of. Not the surface version of yourself that operated when options existed, but the layer underneath. The thing that was there before the palace and the crown and the bonding ceremony and everything that had been built on top of the original. She had been a queen. A queen operated within systems, managed them, navigated them, leveraged them. A queen needed a court, a territory, a base, allies, the architecture of legitimate authority to function within. All of that was gone. Closed, bought, frozen, burned. What was left was not a queen. The wolves rose from their sitting positions simultaneously, all six, without signal, in the same instant. They turned north, not east toward the reaches, not south toward the capital, but north toward the upper mountain range, toward the territory above the frost ridge that had no settlements and no roads and no name on any survey map she had ever seen. The pale wolf appeared from the darkness at the road's edge. It had crossed the river after all. It looked at her, and the look was not patient this time. It was direct. It was the look of something that had been waiting long enough and had arrived at the point where waiting was finished. Celine looked at the runner. "Tell the council I received the message." She turned the horse north. The pale wolf moved ahead of her into the dark, and the lines on her arms burned silver white, bright enough to cast light on the road in front of her. And for the first time since the arena, she felt something that was not cold and not grief, and not the hard, pragmatic calculation of a woman running out of moves. It was older than all of those things. It had been waiting in her blood since before she was born. And it was done waiting. She rode into the dark, and the mountain rose before her, and the wolves ran ahead, and the thing that had been building in her since the shrine reached the surface of her skin and kept going. And the woman who rode north was not the queen who had stood in the secondary processional line with her spine straight and her face composed. That woman was finished. What rode north now had not yet found its name, but the mountains knew it, and soon the kingdom would too. The upper mountain range had no name because no one who had entered it had come back with enough left in them to name it. Celine rode until the horse could not continue, and then she walked, and the wolves moved around her in the dark, like a current finding its course around stone, not leading anymore, not demonstrating holds on a cliff face, but surrounding her in a way that felt structural, the way a fist surrounds what it holds. The pale wolf stayed at her left. The lines on her arms had stopped burning with the sharp insistence they'd had on the road and settled into something steadier, a low, continuous light that was visible through her sleeve when she looked at it, and that she had stopped looking at, because the looking was a distraction, and she did not have distractions to spare. She did not know exactly what she was walking toward. She knew it the way she had known to go north on the mountain the first time. Not language, not plan, but orientation. Something ahead of her that had been waiting longer than she had been alive, and that was not going to wait much longer. The temperature dropped another degree with every 100 feet of altitude. Her breath came out in hard white plumes, and her ankle had stopped hurting, which she recognized as the wrong kind of improvement. The cold had gotten deep enough into it to mute the signal, which meant the joint was in a worse state than the pain had been reporting. She adjusted her gait and kept moving. The plateau appeared at the top of a long ascent that crested without warning, the slope simply ending in a flat expanse of rock and ice that stretched out under the full moon like something deliberate, like something built. The plateau was perhaps 300 feet across and perfectly level in a way that natural geography did not produce, and at its center stood a formation of standing stones arranged in a circle wide enough to have taken 100 men years to position. The wolves entered the circle. Celine entered the circle. The moonlight inside the stones was different from the moonlight outside them. Not brighter, more present. The way a room feels different when the right person enters it. The same air, the same temperature, but the quality of attention in it changed. She walked to the center and stood and looked up, and the moon looked back, and the lines on her arms blazed white, every branch of the pattern simultaneously, bright enough to read by. And something she did not have a word for opened in her chest, and reached upward, and the ancient wolves on the plateau howled, all of them together, a single voice made of many, and the sound went down through the rock beneath her feet, and she felt the mountain range answer it. She did not know how long she stood there. Time on that plateau did not run at the same rate as time in the valley. What she knew when it was done was that the woman who had ridden north from the runner's torch was finished, and what stood in the circle of standing stones in her place was something that the northern kingdom had not seen in living memory. Not a queen waiting to be restored, not a refugee building toward a distant objective. A sovereign who had been separated from her territory and was coming back to it. She came down from the mountain on the fourth day. The wolves came with her. Not 6, 43. She had not counted them as they assembled on the plateau through the long, dark hours. They had arrived in ones and pairs and small groups, from directions she couldn't track, drawn by something she was generating that she could not feel from the inside, the way you cannot hear your own heartbeat in a quiet room until you pay attention to it. 43 wolves of the ancient line, ranging from the pale wolf size to animals nearly twice that, moving down the mountain in a formation that was not military but was organized, and the organization was her. She was dressed differently. The wool dress was gone. She had left it folded on a stone on the plateau, which felt like the right gesture, though she could not have explained why. What she wore now was the traveling coat from Harmon's estate, worn with the collar up, and her arms were visible to the elbow, the silver lines bright and legible in the morning light. She had stopped trying to conceal them. There was no version of what came next that involved concealment. The capital was 2 days' hard travel from the base of the mountain. She knew the king would have riders on every road from the mountains south. The search party that had blocked the river cut had not found her, which meant they had reported failure, which meant Lucian had sent more. She took the old paths, the ones that predated the road system, that ran between the farm territories through hedgerow and dry creek bed, and the wolves ranged around her in a spread that kept the road approaches visible and sent the king's riders' horses into panic specific enough to communicate origin without requiring her to be seen. She arrived at the capital's outer perimeter on the second night. She stopped at the tree line south of the main gate and looked at the walls. There were twice the usual number of torches along the battlements. The gate guard complement had been doubled. Inside, she could see the lights of the royal arena. Not ceremony lights, which were fixed and patterned, but the erratic illumination of something in progress, something that had gathered a crowd. She looked at the pale wolf. "What's happening in there?" she said. The wolf held her eyes, then looked at the arena lights. She had been gone 12 days. 12 days was enough time for a great many things to compound in a palace operating under the stress of a land rejection. Crop failures, wolf abandonments, the particular kind of panic that spreads through a court when the symbolic structures start failing and no one can explain why, and everyone is watching the person on the throne for signs of competence that aren't coming. Vanessa had been managing the throne for 12 days. She had arrived at it through a ceremony the ancient wolves had visibly rejected, in a kingdom whose land was already pulling away from her, without the bloodline connection that every previous occupant of that throne had carried regardless of their other failings. 12 days of that would do specific things to a person who had wanted power without understanding what power in this kingdom was actually attached to. Celine looked at the walls, at the doubled torches, at the arena lights, and made a decision she had been building toward since the standing stones. She walked out of the tree line. The wolves came with her. Demet. The outer gate guards saw her at 300 yards. She watched them see her. The movement on the battlements, one soldier grabbing another's arm, a torch lifted to improve the sighting angle. She kept walking. The silver lines on her arms were lit in the torchlight at distance, visible as something other than ordinary, and the 43 wolves spread out behind and beside her were not visible yet, but their sound was. The low coordinated rumble that wasn't quite growl and wasn't quite communication, but was both, carrying through the cold night air ahead of them. The gate did not close. She had not been certain about that. It could have gone either way. A gate commander who was following the execution order closely might have closed the gate and sent for archers, and then the situation would have required a different resolution. But the gate stayed open, and when she reached the archway, 2 of the 6 guards there had stepped back from their posts, and the remaining 4 were looking at the wolves and at the lines on her arms and at her face, and not one of them moved to stop her. She walked through the gate, inside the outer wall, a courtyard, and then the inner road leading to the palace compound. More guards. The word had moved ahead of her. She could see it traveling in the way attention travels through a crowd, the turning of heads, the rapid communication of people reporting what they'd seen to people who hadn't seen it yet. She kept walking. Steady pace. Not fast. She was not running, not charging, not performing urgency. She was walking toward what was hers with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows where they're going. The inner gate was manned by 12 guards in the king's colors, and standing in front of them was the captain of Lucien's personal guard, a man named Sarek, broad-shouldered, capable, loyal to the king, with the specific loyalty of a man who had been given everything he had by one person and understood that his position existed only as long as that person's authority did. Sarek looked at her. He looked at the wolves. He looked at her arms. "The execution order," he started. "Has not been executed," Celine said. "That's relevant." "Lady Arden, don't." Her voice was flat and quiet and left no room. "I walked through your outer gate, and your men stood aside. I am going to walk through this gate. You can stand in my way, or you can stand aside. Those are the options. I want you to understand that I am telling you this as a courtesy, not as a negotiation." Sarek's jaw was tight. He was looking at the wolves, 43 of them, spreading out across the courtyard behind her, sitting, the way they had sat on the road when the runner appeared, with the particular stillness of things that are not holding themselves back, but simply have not yet moved. Something moved in Sarek's expression. Not loyalty breaking, something more complicated. A man discovering that what he had understood loyalty to mean was contingent on a set of conditions that were no longer present. The wolves hadn't been part of the calculus when he'd pledged himself to Lucian Vale. The bloodline marks on the arms of a banished queen hadn't been part of it. The land pulling away from the throne and the border wolves abandoning their posts, and the arena lights burning at midnight when no ceremony was scheduled. None of it had been part of it. He stepped aside. She heard the arena before she saw it. Voices, not the organized sound of a ceremony crowd, but the fractured noise of people who had gathered for one thing and discovered another. She crossed the inner courtyard and entered the palace and moved through the corridor she had walked 12 days ago in the opposite direction, and the palace itself felt different, the way a room feels after the fire in it has gone out. The same structure, same walls, same floor under her feet, but the warmth gone and nothing replacing it. She came out of the corridor into the arena. The crowd was there. Not the full 10,000 of the moon ceremony, but perhaps 4,000. The court, and the pack lords, and the garrison soldiers, and the palace servants who had slipped into the upper tiers to see what was happening. They had gathered because the word had gone out in the last 2 days that something was wrong with the new queen. Celine read it in their faces as they turned to see what had come through the arena entrance. Not surprise exactly, because a crowd that has been watching a thing deteriorate develops an expectation of the next development, and some of these faces were looking at her the way people look at something they had been waiting for without knowing that was what they were doing. Vanessa was on the throne. Celine stopped in the arena entrance and looked at her, and the 12 days showed clearly. Vanessa had been a composed woman. Whatever else she had managed herself well, the controlled laughter, the calibrated presentation. The woman sitting on the throne now had the composed surface intact, but underneath it something had caved, the way ice looks solid until you understand the stress fractures running through it. Her hands on the throne's arms were not resting. They were gripping. Her eyes moved around the arena with the quick, unfocused quality of someone who has been startled too many times in the last 12 days and whose nervous system is now running that response on a hair trigger. She saw Celine. The gripping hands went white-knuckled. Lucian was in the arena. He was standing to the right of the throne, not on it, which Celine noted. He had given Vanessa the seat while positioning himself as the force behind it, which was both tactically rational and personally revealing. He saw Celine when Vanessa's reaction drew his gaze to the entrance, and his face went through 3 things very fast: shock, calculation, and the particular settling that happens when a man decides to commit to a position regardless of changed circumstances. He moved down from the throne dais toward the arena floor. "This ends now," he said. His voice carried the full weight of his command register, the one he used when he intended the room to feel the authority rather than just hear it. Sarek? He looked at the entrance behind Celine. No Sarek. His eyes came back to her. You are here under an execution order. Every person in this arena is a witness to your presence. Whatever you think you've... Lucian. Her voice cut across his the way his had cut across the elders at the moon ceremony. Not loud, present. Look at the throne. He stopped. The crown on Vanessa's head was moving. Not falling. It was trembling, a fine rapid vibration, the silver catching the torchlight and throwing it in irregular patterns across the faces of the nearest crowd members. Vanessa had both hands on the throne arms and her face had gone rigid, not with composure, but with the effort of maintaining it while something she couldn't explain was happening to the most visible symbol of everything she had taken. Get it off, Vanessa said. Her voice came out wrong. The pitch broken somewhere in it, the precision she usually maintained gone completely. Get it off me, it's... The crown cracked. Not all the way through. A single fracture line, audible in the sudden silence that had fallen over 4,000 people, running from the front of the crown to the back along its center line. The silver split and the two halves separated by a finger's width and stayed there, not falling, just divided. And the torchlight poured into the gap, and the wolves outside the arena answered with a sound that went through the walls like it was moving through air. 4,000 people did not make a sound. Vanessa stood up from the throne. She lifted both hands to the crown, and the moment her fingers touched it, the fracture widened and the two halves fell, one to each side, striking the stone dais with a sound that was impossibly loud in the silence. She looked down at them. Then she looked at Celine, and what was in her face was not anger anymore and not ambition, and not the composed calculation that had gotten her this far. It was the naked expression of someone who had just understood, in a way that could not be argued with, that they had been holding something that was never theirs. Lucian turned from Vanessa back to Celine, and his face was doing the thing it had done in the arena 12 days ago. The clean surface of a decision already made, held in place by will. But the will was working harder now. She could see it working. The wolves' sound through the walls, the broken crown on the dais, the silver lines on her arms lit in the torchlight like something the arena had been built to eventually display. It doesn't matter, he said. Tight, controlled. His hand went to the sword at his hip. None of it matters. You are here under sentence of death, and I am the Alpha King of the Northern... You were, said a voice from the Pack Lord's tier. Old Corvin Stahl, on his feet. His gray beard and his careful voice that had survived 4 administration changes, and the expression on his face now was not political. It was the expression of a man who had waited long enough and had found the moment and was not going to waste it. The title derives from the bond, Stahl said. The bond derives from the bloodline. The bloodline is standing on that arena floor with the ancient wolves at her back and the moon marks on her arms, Lucian, and the crown just broke in half on someone else's head. A pause. You tell me what that means for the title. The Pack Lord's tears stirred. Not all of them. There were men there who had signed the private council decision and would not move against Lucian without a clear assessment of the outcome. But enough. Enough that the sound it made was audible, and Lucian heard it, and his hand gripped the sword hilt and he looked at Celine with the final expression, not calculation anymore, calculation was finished, of a man whose last remaining option was the one that could not be undone. He drew the sword. Celine's wolves came through the arena entrance behind her like water through a broken dam. The crowd surged backward. Soldiers along the perimeter grabbed their weapons and then held, most of them holding, the calculation happening faster in their bodies than in their minds. 43 ancient wolves flooding an arena, silver lines blazing on the arms of a woman standing still in the middle of all of it, a broken crown on the dais. The cost-benefit assessment did not take long. Lucian moved. He was fast. She had forgotten, in 12 days of mountain and cold and survival math, how fast he moved. The alpha training, the 20 years of it, the body that had been built specifically for this kind of moment. He crossed the arena floor at a run, and she had 2 seconds to decide what she was and what she was doing. The pale wolf hit him from the left at full speed, and he went down hard on the stone, the sword skittering out of his hand, and he was up again before she could process it, bleeding from a cut above his left eye, back on his feet, and the look on his face now was something she recognized. Not political, not calculated, not the face of the Alpha King managing a situation, the face of a man who had lost everything in the last 30 seconds and was going to make someone pay the specific price for it. He looked at her across the arena floor, blood running down the left side of his face, chest heaving, the sword 3 feet away and the pale wolf between him and it. "You want to end this," he said. "Then end it. Come end it yourself." The arena was absolute silence. 4,000 people. 43 wolves. The broken crown on the dais and the moonlight coming straight down through the open roof. Celine looked at the man she had bonded 4 years ago across 20 feet of white granite and felt the lines on her arms burning and the mountain in her back, and the entire weight of what she had walked through in 12 days pressing forward into this single point. She took one step toward him, and from the upper tier, Morwen's voice cut through the silence like something she had been holding back the entire time, waiting for the exact moment it would do the most damage. "She killed her father." 4,000 people did not breathe. Morwen's voice hung in the arena air like smoke after a torch goes out, present, dispersing slowly, impossible to unsmell. She was standing at the rail of the upper tier, and her face had the quality it had shown in the corridor 12 days ago when the warmth had drained out of it and left the business-like structure beneath. She had been saving that sentence. Celine understood it immediately. Not a spontaneous accusation, not panic speaking, but a prepared instrument held back until the precise moment it would do maximum damage, and the moment had been chosen well. Lucien with blood on his face, and the arena in silence, and Celine taking her first step across the floor with 4,000 witnesses watching. Celine stopped walking. She looked up at Morwen and let the words sit in the air between them without reacting to them, because the first reaction was the one that set the terms, and she was not going to let Morwen set them. "Say the rest of it," Celine said. Morwen's chin lifted. "Your father did not die of the lung sickness. He was given something in his evening tea over the course of 3 months. Slow, careful, by the woman who stood to inherit his position as his daughter's queen." She let the pause work. "I have the physician's record, I have the correspondence, I have—" "You have what you manufactured," Celine said. "The same way you manufactured the treason charge. The same way you manufactured the processional amendment and the private council session and the charter offer to the Reach settlements." She was still looking at Morwen, and her voice was the same flat level it had been all night, not because she felt flat. Something in her chest was doing something complicated and old and unresolved, because this was her father they were using, her father's death being put in her hands in front of 4,000 people. And the thing that was complicated in her chest had nothing to do with guilt, and everything to do with grief that she had not been permitted to finish, but because the level voice was the one that reached the tears, the one that didn't confirm what Morwen was trying to produce. "You are very good at manufacturing. You have been doing it since before I understood what I was watching. The physician will testify. The physician will say what you've paid him to say." Celine turned away from the upper tier and looked at Lucien. He was standing in the same position, blood drying on the left side of his face, and he was watching her with an expression that had shifted again. The committing to violence look gone, replaced by something more complicated. The look of a man listening to a proceeding that he had thought was finished and is discovering has additional material. "Lucien." He said nothing. His jaw was tight. "You know she's lying," Celine said. "You've known Morwen longer than I have. You let her work because she was useful and her objectives aligned with yours, and you did not care what she was as long as the outcome served you. That's a fair accounting, and I'm not asking you to dispute it, but you know what she is, and you know what she builds, and you know whether the thing she just said is the truth or another instrument." Silence from him. 5 seconds of it. The arena waited. "Your father was dying when you married me," he said finally. His voice was quieter than she'd heard it in the arena, stripped of the command register. "I knew that. It wasn't the sickness she gave him. He was already—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that was not quite guilt, but was the shadow of it. The shape guilt leaves on a person who has been avoiding it long enough that they've gotten good at the avoidance, but not good enough to make it invisible. "She didn't kill him." "I know she didn't," Celine said. The arena exhaled. 4,000 people making the sound of a held breath released. Morwen's hands gripped the tier rail. "You cannot simply—" "You're done," Celine said. She did not raise her voice. She did not look up at the tier again. She said it to the arena floor, to the space in front of her. in the tone of someone closing an account. Whatever you say next, from that rail or anywhere else in this kingdom, is finished before it starts. You spent 15 years building toward this, and it is done, and I need you to understand that clearly before we go any further with the rest of this night. Morwen opened her mouth. The pale wolf, sitting 10 feet from Celine's right, turned its head and looked up at the tier and made a sound that was not a growl and not a howl, but something between them, something lower and more fundamental, and Morwen closed her mouth. The two guards nearest her on the tier level took a step backward without being instructed to. Some instincts do not require orders. Lucian had not picked up the sword. That was the information Celine was working with. He had not retrieved the sword when the pale wolf had moved away from it, and he had not made another approach, and he was standing in the arena with blood on his face, and something in his posture that was not surrender exactly, but was the posture of a man who had run out of the specific energy required to continue the current approach, and had not yet found a different one. She walked toward him, not with the 43 wolves behind her, not with the silver lines performing themselves, just herself walking across white granite toward the man who had placed a crown on another woman's head 12 days ago in front of 10,000 witnesses. The distance closed to 10 feet. 5. She stopped. Up close, he looked older than he had at the ceremony. The 12 days had cost him something. Not the way the mountain had cost her, which had been a burning away, a reduction to essential material. What had been taken from Lucian in 12 days was different. It was the particular aging that happens to a person when the story they have been telling themselves about their own choices stops holding together and they have to stand in front of what they actually did without the story's insulation. "She's going to stand trial," Celine said, quiet enough that it was between them and not the arena. Morwen. Formal proceedings. Full evidence reviewed by the Pack Council, judgment rendered by the assembled lords. Whatever she actually did and didn't do goes on the record and is judged by the record. That's how it happens. Lucian looked at her. And Vanessa. Celine looked at him steadily. Vanessa wanted a crown. She found the fastest road to it, and she took it, and the road ran through you. The judgment for what she did is yours to carry more than hers. A pause. She'll be removed from the palace, returned to her father's house. No charges. Something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude, that would have been the wrong read, more like the small recalibration of a man receiving information that is fairer than he had calculated for. "And me," he said. "The title ends tonight," Celine said. "That's not a choice I'm making. The bond broke when you dissolved it. The wolves confirmed it when the crown split. You were Alpha King because the territory accepted you, and the territory has been pulling away for 12 days and is not coming back to you. That's not punishment. That's just what is." His jaw worked. The thing moving behind his eyes was not simple. She had never pretended it was simple, even at the worst of it. He had been a real person to her once, and what had been real between them was not entirely fabricated, even if what he'd done with it was. People were not single things, and she had decided somewhere on the mountain that she was not going to pretend otherwise. Not because it was kind, but because it was accurate, and she had no use for inaccuracy. "Where do I go?" he said. "Anywhere that isn't here," she said. "East. Build something else. You're capable of it." She met his eyes. "Don't come back." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, not the nod of a man agreeing to terms under duress, but the nod of a man putting something down that had gotten too heavy to carry and acknowledging the putting down. He turned and walked toward the arena's east exit, and the crowd in the tiers made no sound as he passed beneath them, and the guards at the exit stood aside, and he walked through and was gone. The arena held its silence for another breath. Then Corvin Stahl's voice from the Pack Lord's tier, steady and deliberate as everything the old man said. "The Northern Kingdom has a queen." Morwen's trial lasted 4 days. The physician Morwen had cited retracted his prepared statement on the second day when the Pack Council's advocate presented correspondence that had not been part of Morwen's version of the record, letters between Morwen and a merchant contact in the Southern Territory dating back 7 years, referencing transactions that had nothing to do with timber or wool and everything to do with the slow, careful management of a sick man's household. Celine was not present for the retraction. She did not need to be. She had given the advocate what she had found in the shrine's lower chamber on the third night. A sealed case containing documents that the Moon Queens had maintained as a bloodline record, including correspondence from her great-grandmother's time that established the chain of custody for the Northern Territories in terms that predated Morwen's marriage contract and superseded its inheritance clauses entirely. Her father's lands reverted to Celine's direct holding on the third day of the trial. She stood at the window of the room that had been her dressing chamber and looked out at the palace courtyard when the advocate brought her the judgment document, and she took it and held it and did not look at it for a long moment. The courtyard had the pale wolf in it, sitting in the morning light, watching a sparrow investigate the stones near the well. Ordinary, patient, present the way things are present when they are not performing presence but simply existing in it. Her father had been a quiet man, not weak. She had spent too many years letting Morwen's framing of him as someone who needed managing color the way she'd held his memory, and the process of undoing that had been ongoing since the shrine. He had been a man who preferred observation to declaration, who had built his territory through 40 years of consistent small decisions rather than a few dramatic large ones, who had loved her mother visibly and without apology, and who had, after her mother died, made a mistake in his grief that had cost both of them the years that followed. That was the whole of him, not a victim, not a fool. A man who had made a grief-driven error and paid for it until the payment exceeded any reasonable accounting. She had not killed him. She had also not saved him, and she had spent several dark hours on the mountain plateau, understanding the difference between those two things and making her peace with it. You could not save everyone you loved from every consequence of their own choices. You could be present and honest and available, and sometimes that was not enough, and the not enough was not the same as fault. She set the judgment document on the dressing table and went to find Mira. But the girl was in the palace kitchens, which was where Celine had told her to go 12 days ago, and where, it turned out, she had remained. Not out of fear, but out of the particular stubbornness of a 16-year-old who had decided that leaving the palace entirely would be a form of abandonment she was not willing to commit. She had been helping in the kitchens, the head cook reported, with the slightly bewildered expression of someone who had received unexpected competent assistance and did not know how to account for it. Mira looked up from the table when Celine came through the kitchen door, and her face did the thing young faces do when relief and emotion arrive at the same time and cannot be sorted fast enough to present only one of them. Her eyes went immediately to Celine's arms. The silver lines, visible, the branching pattern that had settled into a steady low luminescence rather than the blazing intensity of the arena. "You're back," Mira said. It was not a sophisticated thing to say, and she seemed to know it. "I told you to eat something," Celine said, "not move into the kitchens. The cook makes better bread than the upper hall." Mira stood up and her hands went through the familiar laced-together position in front of her stomach, the ink-stained knuckles, the young face that had not yet learned to keep everything out of it. Is it finished?" Celine considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "The part that needed to be finished is finished," she said. "The part that comes after is starting." She looked at the girl. "I need an attendant who already knows how I take my water, and who has the sense to close a door quietly when there are things in the corridor that shouldn't carry. The position is yours if you want it." Mira blinked. Her eyes went bright at the edges again. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, and this time the title did not sound like form. It sounded like something the girl had been holding carefully for 12 days and was now returning to its proper place. Wholesome. The rite of Moonfire was not a ceremony Celine had read about in the palace library. It was not in the histories she had studied or the bloodline records she had examined or any of the survey maps and cultural documents she had moved through in 4 years of trying to understand the kingdom she had married into. It existed in one place, the standing stones on the plateau, carved in the old wolf tongue at a depth that suggested the carving had been made with something other than a chisel. The ancient wolves performed it on the night of the full moon, 3 weeks after Celine's return. The arena was full. Not 4,000 the full 10,000, and people standing on the walls and in the windows of the buildings overlooking the compound, because the word had traveled through the kingdom in the 3 weeks since the night of the broken crown, and what it had described was not a political transfer of power, but something the Northern Kingdom had not had occasion to describe in living memory. And people had come from the Frost Ridge and the Eastern Province and the Southern Salt Flats to be present for it. The wolves entered the arena in a procession that moved in the branching pattern. the same pattern as the shrine walls, as Celine's arms, spreading from the entrance across the white granite floor in lines that filled the space. At their center, the pale wolf carried something in its mouth that was not a thing Celine had expected, and that stopped her breath when she saw it. The crown. Not broken. Whole. The fracture line sealed as though it had never been. The silver brighter than she remembered it being when it had sat on her head 4 years ago, as though whatever process had healed it had also clarified it, burned away the political weight it had accumulated, and left the structural thing underneath. The pale wolf walked to the center of the arena floor and sat. Celine walked to meet it. The lines on her arms went fully bright as she moved, and the arena responded to the light with silence. The particular silence of 10,000 people experiencing something they did not have prior language for, and are storing in the part of themselves that exists before language. She reached the pale wolf and crouched down and looked at it, and it looked back at her with the eyes that had found her on the road outside the palace gates, on the worst night of her life, and had not left her since. She had thought, on the mountain, in the cold, that what she was being given was power. She understood now that power was the wrong word for it. Power was a thing you took or were given or accumulated through the right combinations of leverage and timing. What the ancient wolves carried for the moon queens was not power. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of a thing that had always been true, made visible and structural. You could not give someone what they already were. You could only show it to them clearly enough that they stopped arguing with it. She took the crown from the pale wolf's mouth with both hands. It was warm, not with body heat, with something that came from inside the silver itself, a warmth that moved through her palms and up her wrists along the lines and into her chest and settled there like something coming home to where it had always been going. She stood up and placed the crown on her own head. The wolves howled, all of them simultaneously, the 43, and more that had come in from the mountain range and the border territories. Animals that had been absent from the kingdom for weeks, standing along the arena walls and the rooftops visible through the open arena ceiling. A sound that went through the stone floor and through the walls and through the bones of everyone present and continued after the physical sound had technically ended, the way some sounds continue in the body after the air stops carrying them. The 10,000 did not cheer. Not immediately. What they did first was something older than cheering, a collective physical response, the kind that precedes conscious choice, people's hands going to their chests and their heads dropping and the weight of recognition moving through the crowd in a wave from the arena floor outward. The pack lords first, then the soldiers, then the merchants in the upper tiers and the servants who had slipped in from the palace, and the people standing on the walls who had traveled from the frost ridge and the salt flats to be present for something they couldn't name. Then the sound. Not organized, not ceremonial, raw, the sound a crowd makes when something they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting arrives and the waiting releases all at once. Corvin Stall was weeping in the pack lord's tier. He did not appear to be doing anything about it. Mira, standing at the arena entrance with her ink-stained hands pressed flat against her sternum, had her eyes open very wide and was not blinking. Celine stood in the center of the arena with the crown on her head and the wolves around her and the silver line steady and present on her arms, and felt the territory she had been separated from for 12 days settle back around her the way a landscape settles after a storm. Not unchanged, not unmarked by what had passed through it, but present, continuous, still itself. She thought about her father. She thought about the man he had been before the mistake and after it, and she thought about how long she had been carrying the version of him that Morwen had handed her. The weak man, the manageable man, the man whose death was a bureaucratic transition rather than a loss. And she set it down deliberately, in the middle of the arena in front of everyone, without ceremony. Just put it down. Took up the real version of him instead, the man who had built 40 years of consistent decisions and loved her mother visibly and made one terrible error in his grief. That was the man she would carry, the whole man. It did not make the years back. Nothing made the years back. That was the thing about surviving the worst version of a situation. You did not emerge from the other side restored to the condition prior to entry. You emerged as whatever the passage had made of you, and the task was not restoration, but the honest recognition of what you had become and the decision about what to do with it. She was not the girl who had come to this palace 4 years ago with clean faith and an unexamined inheritance. She was not the queen who had stood in the secondary processional line and kept her spine straight while her world was systematically taken apart. She was not even the woman who had ridden north from the runner's torch, with the calculation of survival running through everything. She was what all of those women had produced. The distilled thing. The version of herself that the fire had left when it was done burning away everything that wasn't essential. That woman was who the kingdom had now. Morwen was remanded to house arrest in the eastern province, Harmon territory, which had a quality of appropriateness that Celine did not arrange deliberately but did not prevent. Her father's lands were administered by a council Celine appointed from the local territory holders, people who had worked the land for generations and knew it in the specific detailed way that only proximity over time produces. Vanessa returned to her father's house and was not pursued and was not discussed in the palace in Celine's presence. The woman had wanted a thing and had found the fastest road to it, and the road had ended where it ended. Whatever she built from that point was hers to build. Lucian's last reported location was the Eastern Territory border, moving outward. No one came back from that with more than that. 3 months after the arena, the palace had changed in the way that institutions change when the specific pressure that was deforming them is removed and the original structure is allowed to reassert itself. Not overnight, not completely, but steadily, in small daily increments that accumulated into something visible over the length of a season. The servants moved through the corridors with the different quality of deference she had learned to read accurately now. The Pack Lords' meetings had a different texture. The border reports were different. Wolves returning to the northern line. 3 at first, then the number climbing weekly. The border presence rebuilding itself with the same unhurried logic as everything the ancient wolves did. The crops recovered, slowly. Agriculture was slow. But the reports came in from the eastern settlements and the Frost Ridge territories, and even the salt flats in the south, and the pattern in them was consistent, and Celine read them each morning at the desk in what had been Lucian's study, and was now simply her study, with Mira sorting the correspondence at the side table and the pale wolf sleeping in front of the fire. The pale wolf slept in front of the fire every morning now. It had made the decision sometime in the first week and had not revisited it. One evening, she stood at the balcony above the courtyard and looked out at the northern mountain range, visible on clear evenings as a dark mass against the sky, the peaks, the highest points in her view. The cold was real. The northern autumn was not a season that permitted sentiment about the outdoors. But she stood in it without going inside, because there was something she wanted to look at, without glass between her and it. The pale wolf came to stand beside her. It put its head against her left hand, and she let her hand rest on top of it. And they stood there looking at the mountains together. She thought about this woman who had walked out of this palace's gates 12 days after the bonding ceremony that was supposed to have made her safe, with nothing but dark wool and a swollen ankle and the cold. She thought about what that woman had believed in that moment, that the choices that had been made about her were the final word on what she was, that the systems that had been used to dismantle her were stronger than whatever was left after the dismantling. She had not believed that entirely, even then. Some part of her had pointed north and started walking, but she had believed it enough that the mountain had been genuinely necessary. Not symbolic. Necessary. She had needed to go up there and find out what was left when everything else was gone. And the answer had not been a title or a crown or a bloodline record in a shrine. The answer had been this: the capacity to stand somewhere and look at what was ahead rather than back at what had been taken, and to do the next thing, and the thing after that, and to keep doing it without the story of her own suffering as the engine running it. Suffering was real, and she was not dismissing its cost. But it was a fire, and fires go out, and what they leave behind is not charred nothing. It is ground cleared for what grows next, if you are willing to do the growing. The mountain range held its shape against the sky. The wolves on the northern border were coming home. The crown on her head had been placed there by her own hands. She breathed the cold air in and held it and let it go. "All right," she said quietly, to no one and to all of it. "Let's see what comes next." The pale wolf pressed closer against her hand, and the silver lines along her arms caught the moonlight. And below in the courtyard, the ancient wolves that had chosen her twice once by blood, and once by every terrible mile of the road between the arena floor and the standing stones, settled into their evening positions around the palace walls in the northern kingdom continued. And the queen who had been remade by the fire of her own worst season stood in the cold and was not afraid of any of it. She was home, and this time she had built the walls herself.